Good afternoon and welcome to The Deal. I'm your host, Ed Clark. It is Saturday, September 26, 2020. Like I say it every time, but the year's flying by. Last week, we woke up to the shock of Ruth Bader Ginsburg passing away and all that we knew that was going to portend. And I think we knew that the Republicans were not going to waste any time in trying to find a nominee to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Last week, we brought in Al McShirley, one of the preeminent civil rights attorneys in the country, who actually had some connection to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg kept him from going to prison on a sedition charge. Al McShirley is the last person in America who was charged with sedition and was facing prison time. There's a Supreme Court case, McShirley versus McClellan, that I recommend that you go and take a look at and read. It's interesting because right now, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and his AG, Bill Barr, keep talking about sedition and maybe putting troops in the street. And it's a direct line towards the case that includes Al McShirley. So we were fortunate to have him last week. If you didn't see that episode, I recommend that you go back and look at it. Al also tells a whole bunch of other stories. And then in addition to that, he has a good handle on the Supreme Court. He's actually argued cases in front of Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. So again, this week, we're fortunate enough to have an all-star panel. Joining us this week are going to be, as always, Val Atkinson, the host of Connections here in the Raleigh-Durham market, Dr. Felecia Harris, who's down at University of North Carolina at Charlotte, Nicole McFarlane from Fayetteville State, and a new member of the panel this week, and we'll introduce him in just a minute, Ken Harris, one of the best attorneys in the state of North Carolina, handles a lot of personal injury and police-related cases. In addition to, he's like the busiest man in America, I believe. He has his hands on some of everything, and I've been knowing Ken Harris for over 30 years, and I felt like he's the right person to talk about all the issues we have this week. But in the meantime, I want to first go to Val Atkinson. Val Atkinson, welcome back to The Deal.
Thank you, Ed. It's good to be here as always.
Well, Val, you know, the AG from Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, comes out and gives the result of what he says was a grand jury investigation of the Breona Taylor case. I don't have to remind folks, but I'll just give you just the snapshot here. March 13th, some police show up at her door, supposedly with a no-knock warrant. Now they say they knocked. We're not sure what happened, but the result is a 26-year-old woman who had no criminal record, and I don't think anybody would agree that the police should have shown up at her house, ends up dead. And for the last 6 months, the family's been seeking justice. And it turns out that the AG says that there's no police culpability in the death of Breona Taylor. Val Atkinson, give me your quick and dirty, and then we'll start to bring in the rest of the panel on what you expected when this went to AG Cameron, and were you surprised at all at the results?
Well, I was not surprised at all, Ed, to be very frank with you. As we've shared on the show that we host, Connections, I've served on grand jury. And of course, I'm sure there are a lot of our listeners and viewers out there who've done the same thing. And, you know, what possibly could have happened, because none of us were there, but what possibly could have happened is that the district attorney or the attorney general could face a grand jury and say, we have evidence, we have a witness that heard the police say, police, they announced themselves, they did knock, and they entered according with the rules, and then just cut it off right there. And they won't say anything about the other 11 people that they interviewed that said they heard nothing. That's just an example of how grand juries are handled. And, you know, garbage in, garbage out. If this is all of the information that you're getting, you're being asked to make a decision as a grand jurist based on the information in front of you or what you've been told. And that's where the whole anecdote comes from when people say, you know, a good attorney could indict a ham sandwich. And they're right about that, because the grand jury is going to only act on what they've heard. So I knew that the AG was a Republican, albeit a Black Republican. I knew of his association via marriage with Mitch McConnell. And it was no question in my mind how things were going to come out. So to answer your question, there were no surprises when the verdict was rendered.
Well, so that's a good time to bring in our whole panel here. And I want to go to Ken Harris first. Ken Harris, first, welcome your first visit in on the deal. And thanks for coming in with us today.
Thank you.
Well, so Ken, you hear Val. Val's been on the grand jury before. I'm pretty sure that you've had cases that have gone to grand juries and you've had to deal with district attorneys and wrongful death and those kind of things. Give me your assessment of what you heard Daniel Cameron say and what you know about the Taylor case. You know, what were your expectations going into this?
Okay, first, let me start by mentioning that I'm a civil attorney. So I've handled many police liability cases very similar to Ms. Taylor's case. Some have been extremely high-profile cases. And in fact, I think I still have the distinction of having one of the largest police liability settlements in Charlotte history. So I've handled these cases from a civil vantage point, not a criminal vantage point. So I have not had any direct experience with the grand jury system or process, but the civil cases that I've handled have sometimes been ancillary to those processes. Let me, and because of that, I have a different view of these types of situations. And let me say this, there's a difference between what's fair and moral and what's legal. And I think the real problem in many of these cases is that it is very challenging when you have a situation like the Breona Taylor case, when you have a sense of what's fair, what's right, and what's moral, but then you're asked to analyze the situation concerning what's legal. Because if you take a look at some of the cases I've handled, many of them start off with an uproar in the community about what happened from a fairness and a morality standpoint. And I have oftentimes, in looking at these cases, told the community that we have to wait and look at all the facts before we make a final determination concerning the legalities. We may sense and know what happened was wrong from a moral standpoint, but you're talking about apples and oranges when you start getting into legalities. If you go back and take a look at the Breona Taylor case, there are some challenging facts when you're talking about indicting someone relative to a criminal issue. You know, officers, and I really hesitate to go down this road because our community finds this a tough discussion. Officers are, when you start talking about legalities, you cannot look at their actions in hindsight. they are judged in a moment. And Ed, you know this, if you take a look at the Supreme Court law, they're allowed to exercise their discretion in a moment and in an instant. You cannot add facts later, and you cannot add facts that existed prior. So they're only judged by what they confronted in that moment of desperation, or that moment of excitement, or that moment of challenge. And they make their decisions in that moment, and then they're judged later legally based on what they perceived in that moment and how they reacted. That may be the challenge that the grand jury faced in the Breona Taylor case, is that if you really look at the facts, and I don't really want to go into all of the background facts, there may be some challenges in terms of what those officers knew and were confronted with in that moment that may provide them some cover from a legal standpoint relative to their actions. So that's kind of how I look at it. I've been confronted with the same situation in many of the cases that I've handled, is that I've gone in, been very, very upset at what happened. But then when you start looking at it from a legal standpoint, you find that the analysis is going to be very complex.
I hear you completely, Ken Harris. But I'm going to turn to Nicole McFarlane, because Nicole, you and I, we're rabble rousers. We don't care about that. We want justice for Breona, and I know you work with a lot of young people, and you're hearing what those young people are saying. You hear Ken Harris. He's had to try to get justice for people who have been wrongfully killed. But he's also saying we also have to temper our emotions. Talk to me about what your emotions were when you heard it, and now in light of hearing what Ken Harris says, does that change your view or make you think any different?
You must have seen, Ed, when the attorney was speaking, when Ken was speaking, me shaking my head and just, probably registering visually my distaste for that kind of so-called justice. And I realize I bring a layperson's understanding to the table, so I definitely acknowledge that. But I can't imagine that we continue what's legal. I'm thinking about what Attorney Crump said. Just because something is legal, it doesn't make it correct, and it doesn't make it moral, and that's exactly what Attorney Ken said. But at what point are we trying to get this closer to what we need for justice, for what we need to respect and affirm the lives of Black people, Black women? I mean, and it's so sad because she's along a long list of women, Black women, who were murdered in their own homes. And I wonder, at what point are we going to, one thing I guess I could say I have a problem with, as a humanities professor, I always say that we sometimes are speaking at cross purposes when I speak to lawyers, because lawyers believe in the law, whereas I believe in the humanities, which is a plural idea. And so I tend to reject these kinds of binaries, like what is legal and what is not legal, and what is right and what is wrong, but try to bring in together a more nuanced sense of what we need to go forward as a community. And I think sometimes when we are always looking to the law, we put ourselves at an inherent disadvantage. And I guess I'm trying to say it in as nice a way as possible without sounding like the rebel rouser that you keep accusing me of being. But at the same time, I have to say I'm very disappointed, but I can't say I was surprised. And the reason I wasn't surprised was because a couple of weeks ago, the civil, the settlement that Breona Taylor's family got, it was, they were touting it as being the largest settlement of its kind. And I just remember really the civil attorney, I can't remember her name, but what she was saying is she sounded very apologetic, even though she said it was $12 million. She was like, well, I know this isn't what we want. So at that point, and also because, you know, that Cameron dude was on was on the RNC, was speaking for the RNC. I kind of expected nothing, but she had set the bar. So I think she went out of her way to make sure we set low expectations for what was going to happen with the grand jury. And I think that I can't help but think that maybe that the grand jury and the city being in the settlement, that there had to be some backroom dealing, some kind of behind the scenes conversation that on the one hand, they gave these sort of like empty promises of reform that really have no teeth whatsoever, no enforcement teeth, but kind of just a gesture towards reform, and money for the family, which doesn't even begin to address the loss, you know, and all I can think is just the fear of like me just being a Black woman. I mean,
I hear you. I hear you.
I don't know. I feel really uncomfortable about
yeah. I want to remind everybody you're watching The Deal with Ed Clark. We have our all-star panel again this week. You know, we got Val Atkinson in. We have a new member of the panel, Ken Harris. You were just listening to Nicole McFarlane. Before we take a break, there is another Black woman, since you mentioned it, Nicole McFarlane, Black women, Dr. Felecia Harris from University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And you're listening to the conversation, Dr. Harris. I'll ask you again, just viscerally, what was your feeling when you heard what the Daniel Cameron said, and this whole notion that, you know, you have to sort of temper justice with the law. You live with a lawyer. I will also disclose that you're married to Ken Harris. So I'm pretty sure you guys have some interesting discussions about things. So again, your visceral feeling about what happened in the Taylor case.
So this week, and I can give you some context, this week in one of the classes that I'm teaching, we've been looking at the historical context in the classes on Black film and providing some foundation for students. So as we analyze, they have some, you know, foundation of what they're actually looking at. And so we were looking at this week, The Birth of a Nation. Many of you may have seen that in its whole context. And so at the same time we were looking at that material, of course, this was going on with Breona Taylor. And so my initial reaction was just to look at the historical context of violence against women of color, particularly African-American women. We came here in the Middle Passage, violence against women. Once we were landed here in America, violence against African-American women, and really not even thought about as, quote, women. We were thought of as property. And so some of those historical traumas we still see today in 2020. I had my students and I was talking about the Breona case versus what we just looked at in terms of a historical, historical perspective, and violence against African-American women, and this whole almost dismissive nature of life. Even with the monetary settlement, still this whole dismissive nature of African-American women's lives. And it was interesting because I was looking at some research this morning and looked at one in particular act that connected to our Vice President Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, the Violence Against Women Act that came out in 1994. And in it, you can see, of course, some of the goals and objectives they had. But in some of the backlash, of course, we see an increase of policing against women. Even though the law was supposed to help support some of that, we now can look at, you know, some of the statistical data and see those numbers have gone up. So I like many of the, I was not surprised. I tried to prepare my students because of course that came up as a topic, and then giving them some, again, social context living with the lawyer, even the legal perspective, because we talked about it and I said, okay, I will use some of that in explaining it to students, but not, of course, dismissing their, emotional response to
Right.
what happened.
Yeah, you're gonna have an emotional response. It's a good time for us to take a break. Let's take a break. When we come back, I'll come back to you, Dr. McFarlane. But let's take a break. We'll be back in a couple minutes. And you're watching The Deal with Ed Clark. We'll be back in just a minute.
Well, I want to talk to the Trump supporters for a minute. What is Donald Trump's campaign about? He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. And you know how you make America great again? Tell Donald Trump to go to hell. If you can't admire Joe Biden as a person, then it's probably you got a problem. You need to do some self-evaluation, because what's not to like? He is as good a man as God ever created. He said some of the most incredibly heartfelt things that anybody could ever say to me. He's the nicest person I think I've ever met in politics. This is a defining moment in the future of the Republican Party. We have to reject this demagoguery, and if we don't reject Donald Trump, we've lost the moral authority, in my view, to govern this great nation.
Why in this nation do Black Americans wake up knowing that they could lose their life in the course of just living their life?
Part of the point of freedom is to be free from brutality, from injustice, from racism, and all of its manifestations.
We have to let people know that we not only understand their struggle, but they understand the fact they deserve to be treated with dignity. They gotta know we're listening.
Reforming policing in this country means creating a national standard on use of force and conditioning federal funds for police departments on adoption of that standard. It's about reining in qualified immunity. We hold police officers accountable.
We can't turn away. Now is the time for racial justice. I believe with every fiber in my being, we have such an opportunity now to change people's lives for the better. It's about who we are, what we believe, and maybe most importantly, who we want to be.
And welcome back to The Deal. I'm your host, Ed Clark. We had a very animated first segment. I hope everybody heard what we were talking about, because it's very important. There's a lot of issues here that we need to unpack. I want to continue this discussion about the Breona Taylor case, in particular, Daniel Cameron, Val Atkinson. I want to turn to you first. We've acknowledged that, he's shown up on lists of potential for the Supreme Court. And I was looking at his performance, and I will call it a performance, because I took what he was doing as trying to get affirmation from the right that he's their boy. They can count on him, that he's gonna do the right thing here in this case. And he even mentioned the fact that people from outside of Kentucky didn't understand Kentucky. He mentioned that celebrities were going to say things and other people, outsiders, were going to say things, but they don't understand Kentucky. I actually do understand Kentucky. I'm actually a Kentucky colonel. I was named a Kentucky colonel by Governor Beshear over a decade ago, the current governor's father, for my work I did in Kentucky. But Val Atkinson, before we get back to the other part of the discussion, I'm just really disturbed by folks like Daniel Cameron. Can you deconstruct these Black Republicans like Daniel Cameron for me?
Why would you give me an unattainable task? I mean, you can't do that. Can't get in the minds of folk. But you and I talk a lot, Ed, and I believe where you're going on this is some of the motivations behind people like our good Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Clarence admittedly said that he saw two lines when he was trying to map out his trek for success in the legal profession. And the line in the Democratic Party was a little long, and he decided to listen to what the Republicans had to say. He was not as politically astute as he grew to be, and he accepted some advice, and he became a member of the Republican Party. And he sounded as if he had a twinge of regret there, but he never would say that. Even if you ask him directly, he would not admit that he had any regret for what he had done. I think he set the bar. And I think many Republicans have found that they can go after certain people in the African American community, dangle certain things in front of them, and get them to be witting or unwitting sycophants for their cause. And that's worked. I think that Daniel is no exception here. I think Daniel could have seen himself as a Supreme Court justice. I think Daniel relied heavily, and I'm going on the press conference that he held to make the announcements that he made. He referred to his staff behind him on a couple of occasions as when it went to issues regarding technical issues. So my question has always been, how competent of an attorney, of a lawyer is he? Did he depend upon the staff? And we know where they were coming from, where their allegiance lie, that entire staff. So let's hope, for Daniel's sake, he's still a human being. Let's hope for his sake that this works out well for him, because he's put his whole life and his family and his reputation on the line here, because it will never, ever be forgotten. What he's done, how he did it, and for whom he did it.
Well, so you're much more diplomatic than me. I had written a piece earlier this week that I haven't published yet because I had to pull it back because I said some very unflattering things about Mr. Cameron and made some accusations that I don't know for sure. But I kept thinking about Django Unchained while I was writing the piece in the character that Samuel L. Jackson played, and I kept thinking about Uncle Ruckus from the Boondocks, and I'll just leave it at that, and we'll move on from Daniel Cameron because it makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I do have to re-edit that piece though because I think I was a little bit strong. Before we get too far afield though, I want to bring Ken Harris back in here, and I know Dr. McFarlane, I need to talk to you about something as well. But Ken Harris, when we were ending up the discussion in the first segment, we were talking about how the law and so on and so forth. The other part of this, though, there was a civil settlement, and Dr. McFarlane mentioned this. It was a significant one, for sure. The money never brings back the person that's dead. But I want you to tell me about how you weigh what you ask for in terms of monetary compensation. And then is there anything else you can extract when you have these settlements? Because I did hear them talk about the city of Louisville maybe doing some police reform based on the settlement that was received by Breona's family.
Well, first, before we get to that, let me just mention, kind of relevant to the other conversation that we had. It's tough because I have represented these families, African-American families who have had their family members killed by the police. I've been to funerals, I've sat with weeping mothers, but before that, I actually led marches and marched in the streets for Black causes, and have always been a very, very strong advocate relative to our community, not only in terms of civil rights, but economically. And most people know who I represent relative to those issues. That is a different conversation than when you analyze the facts in a particular case. And that's where I think sometimes we struggle, is that every single case has a different set of facts. And when you start talking about whether or not a grand jury indictment is proper, or whether or not a municipality is liable, you have to base that on the facts. Everything that Mr. Atkinson said and Ms. Harris and Ms. McFarlane have said, all those things are valid and accurate and important. But you will note that we've not had a discussion about the underlying facts in the Breona Taylor case. And so there's room for all of us to be right. I don't disagree. What happened to Ms. Taylor is horrific, and I don't care if they paid her $100 million. I've been there. That does not bring a family member back. And believe it or not, I don't care how much money you get, it doesn't bring the family solace. I can tell you that for a fact. I have been there. I've lived it. But when you're talking about these cases and you ask a legal question, then you have to render a fact-based legal analysis. And I think there is some hesitancy to discuss the underlying facts in the Breona Taylor case. I just, as an attorney, I have to be frank. Now, what happened to her was wrong from a moral standpoint. So, you know, the bottom line is, I just think it's tough sometimes for us to be two-minded when we're analyzing these situations. Unfortunately, these things happen far too often. So we're sitting here having to analyze these things in rapid succession because it seems like every time you turn on the TV, there's a new case. So I agree with what everybody on the panel has said thus far. Now, getting to the situation involving the settlements, you know, it is so challenging for a family and an attorney to try to have a discussion about quantifying the value of a family member's life under these circumstances. The underlying goal is always to twofold. One, to compensate the family in some way for their loss, but also to create a deterrent for the municipality and its employees. I don't want to say that $12 million is any type of deterrent, but the truth of the matter, it is. The goal is to try to create a pause between any actor for the municipality who's out there, because if they do the same thing these officers did, then the municipality is going to have to pay. That doesn't bring Breona Taylor back. So I think Ms. McFarlane is right. No matter what the number is, it's inadequate. You can have a discussion with the municipality's lawyers about other things that can be done to protect against this happening again. To be blunt with you, you got to go all the way back to the first thing I said. You're still in a situation when these officers are making split-second decisions, according to the Supreme Court. So sometimes you wonder how much of a effect, you know, some of these new policies and procedures will have. Which brings us back to the last thing. If an officer engages in conduct that is criminal based on the facts, they ought to be indicted and punished. That's just the way it is. But if you have an act that falls below those thresholds, then the law has a way to handle that as well. So I agree with
I'm going to have to interrupt you just for a second because I failed to bring in something the last time you gave me a chance to say that. And although I agree with Attorney Harris on a lot of the things he said, I think what our listening audience and viewing audience are concerned about, and the people in general, they want to know how can they change these things. They want to know how can they prevent these things from happening. And they may or may not be a part of the law. I recall black codes being the law at one particular point. And we talk about a lot of parts. I grew up in an era that segregation was legal. That was the law back in the 40s and 50s when I started to school. So the law is one thing, but as far as the majority of our people are concerned, we want to know, how do we change a law that's not giving us great benefit? What can we do to make things right, as we call it, right, morally, and those kinds of things? And we'll leave it up to the good graces of attorneys like Attorney Harris here, who appears to be very competent and knowledgeable in what he's doing. They fight the legal battle for us. The rest of us who don't happen to be attorneys, We have to do it another way. Our job, Ed, is to bring it to the people. I see the two doctors here. They are educating the students and that kind of thing. So sometimes we have to make sure we are doing what we're doing and what we can do best.
Yeah.
For the cause, whatever the cause happens to be.
I hear you, Val, and I do want to wrap up what you were saying, Ken. That last part about those decrees that they can put into settlements that can force municipalities to do certain things, and whether or not there's an effect. Like you said, the money is a deterrent effect to some degree, at least for a short time. And then the decrees, but I see Dr. McFarlane over here chomping at the bit. I'm gonna come back to you, Ken Harris. Dr. McFarlane, go ahead.
Okay, I wanna put a question on the table. Maybe Ken Harris can respond to it. But I'm gonna say what I wanted to say. But if I'm not mistaken, isn't it true that municipalities write into their budget that extra $12 million or whatever decrees, whatever kind of damages might be sustained because
they have insurance.
Yes, right. So that's one thing. So I'm not even, okay. So, but what I want to say though is the thing about Black women, how we have been devalued. And this has been the matter of law from what I understand. And I don't understand a lot. Once again, I'm a layperson in this way. It's been grounded, right, in certain discourses and certain discursive understandings and laws that we've had. I mean, in terms of understandings of what is natural law, right? If we're going to look at it from like even just a purely social contractarian standpoint. And so I think if we have to look at how Breona Taylor and all these hosts of other Black women have been treated, I think it's important for us to look at the founding documents and the founding fathers that spoke on specifically how Black women are perceived and how Black women should be valued in the lives of Black women. So I immediately think about, in relationship with what Dr. Felecia had to say, looking at how we consider Black women's lives and how we look at how Black women have been framed and envisioned in our culture. We have to look at the notes on the state of Virginia, which was one of the early documents by Thomas Jefferson. Now, of course, when people think about Thomas Jefferson and his history of Black women, they immediately start thinking about Sally Hemings, and with good reason. But a lot of people don't realize that he wrote most extensively of all the founding fathers on Black women and their perceived low value or complete unworthiness for human life or protection of their lives. And so I think when I want to kind of go and look at what he kind of things he said things like Black women, the first problem is our color. He called it the eternal monotony of Black women's skins, as if they were all one brown, just one monotonous, thing. Like, if anything, Black women are probably the most diverse coloration and the most beautiful diversity in that skin tone variation. He talks about us being, first of all, being unworthy because of our monotonous facial expression, right? That comes, maybe there were monotonous facial expressions when they were looking at him, right? But in terms of like a monotonous facial expression, then he said something about our hair, which makes us less attractive to Black men themselves, saying that a Black man prefers an orangutan over a Black woman. And then he speaks about our lack of physical symmetry. And then he says that we don't even require as much sleep at night. So maybe, I don't know, maybe this is why he perceives, maybe this is why Black women can get murdered in this, because maybe we don't require sleep. I don't know. I wonder how much these ideas, these racist, misogynoir perceptions of Black, particular hate against Black women, and particularly aimed towards Black women. How does this hatred of Black women filter into the everyday public discourse, the public, just the doxa, if you will? This is a rhetorical term. Just the everyday common sense perceptions the unassuming, complete, just
Well,
acceptance.
well, Dr. McFarlane, I'm going to tell you this. I think that it's ingrained in every fiber of the American flag, right? It's in the DNA of the American psyche. Everybody understands that Black women do not, fit in and that kind of thing. I think before we run out of time, I think it's a good time to take a break. When we come back, I want to come back to Ken Harris. I want to finish that discussion about, what municipalities have to do in the end when they're forced to do these decrees and that kind of thing. Everybody hold on for a minute. We'll be right back. You're watching The Deal with Ed Clark with Dr. Felecia Harris, Dr. Nicole McFarlane, Val Atkinson, and Attorney Ken Harris. We'll be back in just a minute.
My voice.
For the first time in our memory, many Americans are asking, does history still have a place for America? There are some who answer no, that we must tell our children not to dream as we once dreamed. Together, tonight, let us say that America is still united, still strong, still compassionate, still willing to stand by those who are persecuted or alone. For those who are victims of police states or government-induced torture or terror, let us speak for them. I believe we can embark on a new age of reform in this country that will make government again responsive to people. We can fight corruption while we work to bring into our government women and men of competence and high integrity. Tomorrow, you will be making a choice between different visions of the future. Are you more confident that our economy will create productive work for our society? Or are you less confident? Do you feel you can keep the job you have or gain a job if you don't have one? Are you pleased with the ability of young people to buy a home, of the elderly to live their remaining years in happiness, of our youngsters to take pride in the world we have built for them? Are you convinced that we have earned the respect of the world and our allies? Let us resolve tonight that young Americans will always find a city of hope in a country that is free. And let us resolve they will say of our day and of our generation that we did keep faith with our God, that we did act worthy of ourselves, that we did protect and pass on lovingly that shining city on a hill.
Welcome back to our final segment for today of The Deal. I'm your host, Ed Clark. We've been talking about the Breona Taylor case, but, we've been trying to talk about it in not just terms of our disappointment and what the outcome of the grand jury and what AG Cameron said. We've been trying to include a lot of other issues into it. We've been talking about the historical component to it. We've been talking about the legal, obviously. We've been talking about our emotions around it and that kind of thing. One thing that Dr. Harris mentioned earlier is film. She talked about the birth of a nation. I've written a long piece about the birth of a nation recently. go to the dealwithedclark.com, look through the past columns, and I have a good assessment of what I think Birth of a Nation means to how we view Black people in general in America. But before we run out of time, I want to finish this discussion with you, Ken Harris, about, because I know it sounds pessimistic, the whole conversation in general, that, maybe, there's nothing we can do because they just hate colored people and we just bound to have to deal with it and that kind of thing if you were just listening cursory. But in all honesty, there is something you can do. People have been out in the streets. We've been doing that part. The NBA and NFL and all these other people, Naomi Osaka, has been talking out publicly. People know Breona Taylor's name. They've been saying her name. But the final part of this that I want to talk to you about today, Ken Harris, is like I said, you can put in some reforms that municipalities at least have to give some lip service to. Talk to me about how you can try to put in some things that municipalities have to do reforms. I do want to clear that up.
Well, first of all, you mentioned the NBA. I'm a big fan of Charles Barkley, and Charles Barkley has said recently, it's all about what we as a community put in place mechanically to develop the changes that we want. And that's why I think Dr. Harris and Dr. McFarlane are so important, and also Mr. Atkinson, because they're educating people about our history and why our activity is so important now when we're faced with a Breona Taylor type of situation. And why is it important to be educated historically? Because it's not about what you can do when a case arises, it's what you do before a case arises. And if you're educated about the history of African-American women and how they've been treated in such a disparate way historically, if you're educated about police violence in the United States against African-Americans, and attorneys like me having to over and over again represent families who have had family members victimized by the police, then it's not about one case, it's about voting. It's about activism. It's about organization. It's about thought. Because I can react with one case. Everybody knows I represented Daryl Turner, the young man who was tased to death in Charlotte. He resulted in one of the largest federal verdicts in North Carolina history. Daryl Turner was an African-American youth who was at work when he was tased to death. Most people don't know that the officer who tased him, believe it or not, was African-American. They think that the officer who tased him was white. You have to understand the facts of each case to do an analysis about that case and then work with the municipality to get the best result. But the bottom line is, before that, what are we doing as a community to educate ourselves so that the municipality and its executives and its politicians and the mayors and the governors represent the ideals and concepts that we focus on? So that's what I'm looking at. It's not about the case and what we can get done, because that's finite. What we can get done politically is infinite. And so I think the time is now, based on what we're seeing and experiencing, to go ahead and organize, make sure we get the vote out, and make sure we have people in place. Because, and I'll end it with this, the Republicans are doing it. Today we will have a Supreme Court nominee that represents their interest. If there was a different president, we would have a different Supreme Court nominee that represented our interest. So I think the goal is to get out ahead of this and make sure that we're politically aware and active so that we can do the things that Dr. Felecia and Dr. Nicole have represented are necessary to not only elevate African-American women, but our Black community as a whole.
Yeah, I hear you, Ken Harris. That's a good point for me to turn to Dr. Harris. I guess I want to end up with you. The last question for you today is again, do students that you encounter right now understand the importance of voting and how they can influence the Supreme Court, how they can make a difference? I know there's been a lot of energy over the last 9 months with people in the street and tearing down statues and all that other stuff. But has it registered that the reason why the Republicans are moving so quickly to secure another Supreme Court seat is because they know that that's really where the power lies?
Well, and I know in our discussions, over the course of just this first semester, one of the things I mentioned to students, even yesterday, we were talking about kind of radicalism and what that is. And if you look at the root of that word, radicalism at its core is to make sure you have accurate information. So in our whole discussion, this morning, having the whole information makes, or impacts a great deal of how you're going to proceed. And of course, yes, we can see it with the Republican Party, from the Attorney General talking about comparing COVID. Someone asked me the question about the Attorney General comparing COVID-19 to slavery. And if you don't really understand the context of slavery and not the glamorization of it, again, in some of the films, some of the media, some of the propaganda, then it does make it a lot more difficult in trying to think of the steps to do as a student. So our students on campus, of course, have had the opportunity to do activism. In this COVID climate, most of it, of course, has been relegated to technological platforms, but I do believe they understand the logistics of how to get there, as Attorney Ken Harris just mentioned, is then how do you get there given we have all these systematic laws in place. And the Republican Party, even our current president, has figured it out. Look at the number of judges at the district court level he's appointed, not just this one or the three. If this one is approved, he will have 3 nominees that have gone through the process, but there are hundreds of judges during his tenure that he has appointed. That's where a lot of the legalities that we now face in this system, those are the individuals that are going to, process those cases. So we have to understand, as again, Attorney Harris has mentioned, we have to understand that process. So I think, at least in my classes, we spend a lot of time having dialogue around what that looks like. And, as a college student, what can they do moving forward?
Yeah, I hear you. Val Atkinson, I want to bring you back in here before we run out of time. Dr. Harris mentions the fact that this may be the 3rd appointment for the Supreme Court for Donald Trump, which every time I think about it makes my stomach hurt, that he would have even been in the position to make 3 appointments to the Supreme Court. It could lock us down for the next 50 years if the court stays with the 6-3. And then there has been talk of expanding the court and some other things. Tell me why I should be hopeful that that's not going to happen, that it's not going to be a 6-3 court for the next 50 years, Val Atkinson.
Well, the jury's still out. We don't know. It's all up to if the Democrats take back over the presidency. That's the first if. And then, of course, the second big if is whether or not the Democrats manage to take over this U.S. Senate. If those 2 things happen, then a choice is there. It is not outside the bounds of the U.S. Constitution to run the number up on the Supreme Court to 13 or 15 even. It can be done. The question is whether or not they have the courage to do that. Now, the naysayers will tell you, well, if you do that, all they're going to do is run it up to 23 when they get in, and then you get this perpetual battle, whatever. That may or may not be the case. The question that we should be asking those folks who take office on January the 20th is, what is your plan to deal with what Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump has done to the justice system over the past 4 years. What is your plan? And if they tell us through their action, well, we've already accomplished our plan. Our plan was to get Donald Trump out of office. Well, does that mean you're going to accept the 225 lifetime judges that they've put in place? And you're not going to do anything about that? If that's the case, that's fine. That's your call. But it lets us know how our support should be leaning in the future. You know, because our question is not whether or not you're going to stop that from happening. By us electing you, we've stopped that from happening, okay? The question is, what are you going to do about what has already happened? And I'd like to hear that myself from a lot of those folks who want to be our representatives, such as Cal Cunningham and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and those kind of people. I'd like to know what is their plan to reverse what has happened to us, not stop the bleeding, but reverse it.
Yeah, well, you know, this last 4 years has been really difficult, I think, for all of us, Val Atkinson and Ken Harris and Dr. Felecia Harris and Dr. Nicole McFarlane. You're just trying to deal with the I call it Trump syndrome that I've developed. You can't sleep. You're worried about your kids. You're worried about the economy. It's like a daily thing that we have to go through. We're now under 40 days until Election Day. Hopefully, we can change things not only in DC but maybe in North Carolina where we are, maybe around the country. I think people are starting to see. We didn't even talk about COVID today. We didn't talk about who the potential Supreme Court nominees are going to be today. That just goes to show how much stuff has gone on, how much destruction Trump being president has wrought. But we can't be only focused on him, right? We have to be, like Ken Harris said, know your history, understand the law, know what you can do in your community to make things better. I want to thank Ken Harris. Thank you so much for being on the panel today. I want you to come back because we didn't even talk about your book. Real quick, tell us about you've written novels before. Tell us about your book and where people can find out about it.
The book is called Dark Trades. The premise is, what if the South had won the Civil War? Where would we end up at right now? And it's about the importance and power of Black perseverance and thought and integrity, and the fact that we're powerful enough ourselves to manipulate and manage and benefit from the system. It can be found at Amazon.com. It's doing real well out there, and I appreciate you having me today, and certainly appreciate Dr. McFarlane and Dr. Harris and Val. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here, and I certainly appreciate all your wonderful words of wisdom.
Yeah. So that and then Nicole McFarlane, tell me what you're working on and anything we need to be looking forward to, or you got anything to tell us?
Yeah, so I'm working on Afrofuturist discourses right now, looking at speculative fictions, utopias, dystopias, Black utopias and Black dystopias, utopias and dystopias. I think right now we are really in, what do you guys think, in a dystopic space or utopic space?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because our next program, I've been working on trying to get some folks around Black futurism on. So definitely, we may even do a special on that, Dr. McFarlane, and we'll, because I want to talk about that. We're definitely not in Wakanda. I can tell you that. I think we're caught between the dystopia and the current reality. How's that?
Yeah. I think right now we can say we're definitely on this plateau, and I want to know, I think how we move forward in terms of in a pessimistic perspective. We move forward. Do we move forward as Afro-pessimists? Do we move forward as Afro-optimists? I don't know. So I think that kind of very much is determinative of what kind of space we move into.
Well, let's get together and talk about that. I want to do that special. And then Dr. Harris, what are you working on right now?
I am working on a book on Sarah Baartman that is looking at Sarah Baartman as this kind of iconic figure, and what does her historical space have to do with how we look at African American women now. And one of the things that I'm just so struck about what's going on now, at the same time that Kamala Harris was nominated, you had these videos or video.
Get your booty to the polls? Sorry.
Well, the one by Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion that was trending.
What about get your booty to the polls?
This one is called WAP, W-A-P.
No, I'm talking about the Democratic Party had an actual.
Oh yeah, they had one.
The actual commercial with just booty dance, booty shots.
Yeah, I saw that. So that's what the book is looking at, kind of the discourse between what happened with Sarah Baartman all the way to we're in 2020. What does that have to do with, African American women and their space and their agency? That was just fascinating that those things happened at the exact same moment. Kamala Harris, Megan Thee Stallion, and Cardi B had all these records. They had all these records from people viewing on videos and top Billboard. And then when I finally did watch the video, it was Sarah Baartman, 2055.
I hear you.
Images.
I hear you. Well, Val Atkinson, I know where to find you because we're on the radio together on next Sunday on Connections on WFXC and WFXK. But I know you're working on another book as well. How are we doing with that, and how's that coming along?
Yeah, well, my latest book is The Electoral College and the Black and Brown Vote, which I sort of pulled that back at the last second. I was writing the afterword, and I was talking about leading up to the election, and it became too daunting. And I said, no, I'm going to write the afterword about the results of the past election. So we can look for the publication of that being out sometime this spring. But I'm going to highly recommend it. We're going to talk about it on the show quite a bit. It talks about, there's a poll, there's a survey. It starts off the book with a survey that I did to find out what is the general knowledge about the Electoral College amongst African Americans in particular, but brown folks and white folks. And then we were able to compare, and we did it nationally. So we had a lot of support, and the poll results are rather interesting. It shows that we got some work to do to understand the governing document that makes our lives go. But I struggled in the beginning to make it flow in such a way that everybody, the average man, could read and understand it, because I had to realize that, one of my advisors told me, you're not in the classroom anymore, Val, and a lot of people may not understand what you're talking about. So we kind of broke it down, and I think it's going to be something that's very readable.
Well, I hear you. So you see, we bring in people who actually do stuff and actually can bring you the information we keep talking about you need to hear. In the meantime, go to thedealwithedclark.com. There you'll read all my columns. You'll see all the past shows. We've had some great guests, like I said, especially if you get a chance, go back and look at last week. Albert Shirley was here. He's been the attorney for the NAACP for years. He is one of the preeminent civil rights attorneys in the country. He's the last person in America to be charged with sedition on a federal level. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the opinion that got him out of trouble and launched him on his legal career. He's been a friend of mine for nearly 40 years. So in the meantime, do something good for somebody this week, and then make sure that you vote. Please vote, and make sure that you select the people that are going to do the best for you. In the meantime, we'll see you next week. Bye.
North Carolinians understand better than most what it means to serve. It's part of who we are. We're often first to answer the call. So when Tom Tillis fails to act while the Russians pay bounties for dead Americans, something is deeply wrong in Washington. I serve with these men and women. These are our friends, our parents, our sons and our daughters. I'm Cal Cunningham, and protecting our soldiers is personal to me. And I approve this message because the way we support our troops is bring them home safe.